This was 1998 when this happened. An old friend of mine asked me to go camping with him. I hadn't been since I was about 12, so I agreed. It sounded fun, and I was excited all week leading up to the trip. I didn't get much sleep the night before because of it. He picked me up just after 5 a.m., and we drove the 100 miles to the park. I managed to get a bit of sleep, so I felt a little better when we arrived. Then he dropped the bomb on me. We still had to walk another 2 hours to the campsite. I tried to talk him into choosing one a little closer, but he swore I'd love it when we made it. With a heavy heart, I followed him. The first half hour wasn't that bad. Most of it was downhill. However, as more time passed, I became sluggish. Halfway there, we took a short break, but were back on the trail before I knew it. The second leg was a lot more uphill. It wasn't long until I was dragging again and not paying attention to where I was going. We arrived at a flat section, and I was relieved. My friend was in front and somehow missed the trap, but I didn't. All I remember was that 1 second, I was clomping along and hitting the ground the next. The contact with the bottom of the hole jolted me awake, and the rush of adrenaline masked most of the pain. As I stood up, my right leg buckled, and I dropped down onto a sharpened stick jutting out below me. Apparently, there were several more stakes in the bottom of the hole, but they had been knocked over, thankfully. When I looked down, I saw the bone sticking out of my shin. Instinctively, I pulled the stick from my leg, and the pain made me even queasier than I already was. I looked up to get an idea of where I was and only saw blue sky edged by trees. I figured the hole was about 10 feet deep or more. It must have taken the idiots who dug it several days. I yelled up for my friend only to see his laughing face greet me over the edge. He didn't know the extent of my injuries at that moment, but when I told him, the laughing stopped and panic replaced it. I asked him what happened, and he told me it looked like some redneck poachers had dug some type of bear trap and I'd fallen into it. I assumed he could simply reach down and pull me out, but that didn't work. So next, he attempted to reach me with a tree limb. This worked at first, but when I tried to stand up, the pain was far too severe. I couldn't put any weight on my right leg. It was obvious I wasn't getting out of the hole without outside help. It was still early in the day, so I wasn't very concerned. I could hear my friend pacing around above me and freaking out. So, I called up to him in a calm voice and told him to get help. The ranger station was only a little over an hour back from where we came. He could easily get help and make it back to me with plenty of time before dark. Once he took off, I was left alone with nothing but the pain to occupy me. By now, it was coming in waves, and the accompanying nausea wasn't making it any better. Initially, I thought I could make a splint, but the moment I tried to tighten it down, I almost fainted. Leaving it alone seemed like the wise decision. I put my head between my knees and waited for the sick, dizzy feeling to pass. Eventually, it did, and I tried to focus on other things. Singing worked for a while. That is until I started hearing thunder and noticed the sky above me getting darker by the minute. Getting a little wet wasn't going to kill me, right? Perhaps I should have considered my circumstances before saying that. The rain was relatively light at first, but within minutes, it was coming down in sheets. I was okay until I began to notice the hole filling with water. My feet were already submerged by the time I realized I was in trouble. I clawed my way up the wall until I was standing, at least the best I was able, and started praying for it to stop. As the minutes passed, more of my body disappeared. After an hour, the storm began letting up, and I could relax. The water level was only about halfway up my shins, and I knew now if it continued at that rate, help would be here before it even reached my waist. Unfortunately, it was just a lull in the storm. Soon enough, the rain was sheeting down again. The only positive about the whole thing was it had taken my mind off the pain in my leg. I tried to be upbeat, thinking back on funny jokes and movies. The next hour was the longest in my life. When help finally arrived, the rain had almost completely stopped. At the time the ropes pulled me out, the water was just below my belt. Thinking about drowning to death in a little hole out in the middle of nowhere still gives me the willies. Once I was out of the hole, the ride to the hospital went by fast. After a surgery where I acquired some screws and a few plates, I was allowed to go home. The next 8 weeks on crutches would drag by, but I was happy to be alive. Broken leg or not. We never got to make up for the lost trip, but I have taken my kids out camping a few times in the years since. While it's on my mind, I may give my friend a ring. We haven't seen one another in a few years, and a camping trip may be the best way to catch up. I'll make sure to keep my eyes open this time. My mom was in the Army a long time ago. She did her time a few years past. She felt a void in her heart, like something wasn't there, and then she found her love for camping and hiking. My mom is actually a camper for 6 years now. She has plans every year for her hiking/camping trips. She's been in the Army, so being prepared is nothing. She has gone hiking and camping in the summer, spring, fall, and even winter in the same mountains, all while my brother is her camping buddy. It's to the point that the little town, before you head into the mountains, knows my mom and brother, calling them the mom who hikes with her son. I live with my dad, and usually I visit her and my brother over the summer. Last year was my last time hiking and camping with her and my brother, and honestly, I hate those mountains and what lies in those woods. The mountains I hike are called Pine Creek Gorge, or in this case, the Grand Canyon of Pennsylvania. The trail is called the West Rim Trail, a 30-mile hiking trail. When I said I hate these mountains, I really do mean it. My mom wanted to beat a new record with me and my brother to hike this 30 miles trail in under 47 hours. I didn't argue and agreed that we could do it. But in reality, I absolutely could not believe my mom. You park your car at the starting point of the trail at Brady Walls Picnic Area and hike all the way to Rattlesnake Rock. Then you have to hike another 10 miles to get to a little town where we get sandwiches, soda, and our ride back to the Brady Walls Picnic Area. We had met halfway through our hike. It was getting dark, and we needed to set up camp. Luckily, we were at a campsite made for this. We were up high in the mountains and had a view. It's surrounded by the woods. My mom and I set up the tent, and after that, my brother set up the inside of the tent. We changed into our so-called PJs and set up a huge fire. This helps keep the animals and insects away, make our food, eat, and then my mom hangs up the food bag in a tree to keep animals out of our food. It's important to remember this food bag. And we settle into sleep. That's when it happened. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, pitch black and blurry. I don't know why, I just did it. And that's when I heard it. I don't know how to fully describe it. It sounded like a porcupine call, but deeper and unanimal-like, more like a bird-like sound. It lasted for about 5 minutes, but it felt like hell. I heard shuffling around the tent as if something was walking towards it. It stopped. I heard the sound of water pouring. And that's when it hit me. It was freaking peeing next to our tent, on my side. I kept hearing shuffles around our campsite. I was able to turn around and see my mom figure upright in the tent. She asked in the lowest voice I heard, "Do you hear that too?" I replied, "Yes." We waited a few minutes, and then my mom finally got up, took her machete, bear mace, and a branded flashlight, and went outside to investigate. If you're wondering where my brother is at this time, he's still asleep. And for those who are wondering why he did not go and investigate, my brother was 11, tall, skinny, and had a baby face like no other. So having a 40-year-old Army woman who was stationed in Afghanistan with a license to kill and is a mama bear on top of that is the way to go. Anyway, I waited a few minutes with my mind racing. What's outside? Is mom okay? Is it fight or flight? Where do I go? I was thinking about what would happen. My mom accidentally hits the tent with bear mace. My brother and I started to cough, feeling our lungs suffocating through this mace, and ran out of the tent into the dark night. All we could see was the small fire pit still burning and my mom standing outside, looking a bit frantic. She asked why we were out. I told her about the mace. She said sorry, and we stood in silence. I kept my side next to the fire, and my eyes glued to the deep, dark, dense forest only a few feet from me. My mom said she saw nothing outside. About a good 20 minutes went by, making sure the mace had evaluated our tent for sure. We went back to the tent, laid down, and my brother went back to sleep. My mom and I had a hard time falling asleep. The idea that something was there in the woods, something waiting for us. In the distance, I heard a pack of coyotes howling, and I remembered all the skinwalker stories I have learned and heard throughout my life. My eyes felt heavy, and I fell asleep afterward. When we woke up, the first thing I did was walk to the place I heard the peeing, and it was clear as day, still wet and smelled like a strong scent of urine. So we got dressed, used the bathroom in the woods, ate, and packed up. We continued to hike the mountains about 11 miles from our last stop. We found a place. It was early noon and lunchtime. My mom asked what we wanted. As she reached for the food bag, she opened it, and half of our food was gone. She looked wide-eyed and her mouth gaping. I looked at her, and she looked at me. She said something that sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't very honest with you, kiddo. I did not want to scare your brother, so I lied. I did see something, is what she said. She explained why she sprayed the bear mace. You see, when my mom got out of the tent, she heard the sound of feet near the tree where the food was hanging. She flashed her light in the direction of the sound, seeing a tall shadow figure lit up like a man. She, of course, does the thing attack first, asked question later with the bear mace. It fled towards the tent. My mom kept spraying the mace till the thing ran into the woods. Not on the trail, into those dense, dark woods. Before we got out, she went back to the tree and saw the bag swinging in the tree, thinking nothing of it. I think it was just a man messing with us, is what my mom always says. But I think it was something else, the strange sounds, the tall figure, how it made no sound of coughing when my mom sprayed it with bear mace. How we are in the middle of the mountains where no other soul is around. And if it was a man, why make those sounds, pee next to the tent, steal our food? You need hot boiling water in order to eat that. We finished our hike, and I did what I usually do. From the bridge that separated us from the town, I crossed it, shouted toward the mountains how much I hate them, and then turned around, walking to the town. The woods are a place filled with beauty and fear, and luckily, I left those woods unharmed. I live next to Yellowstone National Park, which in itself has drawn millions of tourists each year. Part of the reason I am writing this is merely a warning to people who decide to visit during the summer months. Last year, in the summer of 2020, my buddies and I decided to go have a night out and do some camping near a spot we had been to multiple times in the past. After all, this was right after things started to become normal again, and lockdowns were lifted. I decided to head up to the camp spot early to make sure my gear was still set up from earlier that day. I did this to reserve the spot as it's first come, first serve. With everything in hand, I left my house right before sunset. We were all supposed to meet up within the hour, so I didn't really have any concerns about being by myself. I then began my 30-minute drive up to the location. When I finally arrived, I immediately noticed my tent and everything inside was gone. Now, just for some context, I staked the tent down in multiple areas just to be sure it stayed in place while I was gone. Inside was my sleeping bag and a few other miscellaneous items I left to keep it weighed down. However, everything, literally everything, disappeared as if it was never there. I looked around, and even the stakes and rocks I placed on the outside were missing. I immediately knew something was wrong because I did not see any other campers on the way up. Also, keep in mind I do not have cell service as it's a couple of miles back into the wilderness. I then decided to drive back down from where I came to get service and contact my friends to let them know what happened. Needless to say, I was not happy with the situation and knew that whoever took my belongings was still in the area, as it had only been there for an hour or two. However, my friends insisted that I stay and at least hang out for a few hours, since it took weeks of planning. So once I made sure everyone had arrived, I decided to search the area for any sign of footprints or indications that maybe these people were close by. As you can guess, I wasn't able to find anything. I eventually played it off and decided I would just look for it in the morning and contact the Forest Service to report it missing. I also didn't want to ruin the party for everyone and chose to stay. In hindsight, this was by far one of the worst decisions I could have ever made. As the night went on, everything seemed fine. Or so I thought. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, most of my friends decided to call it a night. I ended up sleeping in my truck. That was perhaps one of the better decisions I made that night, along with always making sure to bring my bear spray and sidearm for protection from unexpected guests. I eventually fell asleep. However, it's important to note that I was still a bit on edge, as only a couple of hours before, all of my belongings were taken. I decided to leave my window rolled down a bit just in case I heard anything creeping up on us in the middle of the night. After about 2 hours of being asleep, my worst nightmare came true. At first, I just heard something moving around outside our camp. This was enough noise to wake me up, and I immediately froze and didn't move whatsoever. This was partially because I knew whatever was making the noise was large, not just a raccoon or any smaller creature. I then was paralyzed, just listening intently to whatever was happening outside our camp. My first thought was that it was a bear. We had also had recent sightings in the area. At one point, I swear it could have only been maybe 20 to 30 yards away. Another key point I noticed was that there were absolutely no other noises. Usually, there are grasshoppers or birds, but it was complete and utter silence. Now, in the wilderness, that's never a good sign. It means there's a large predator or something of the like in the area. Meanwhile, it was pitch black outside, and our fire had completely gone out. After about 15 minutes of not hearing anything, I decided I just needed to stop being paranoid. But just as I was about to fall back asleep, I saw something to the right of our campsite. It was just a few yards away from our fire pit and probably about 20 yards from me. To my absolute horror, it was a person. I immediately freaked out. This was no average person either. Let alone the fact that it was 3 or 4 in the morning and we were in someone's campsite. This person was wearing what I made out to be some kind of mask. I got a very good look at whoever it was, and it was a deer skull on their face. They were wearing a black robe, and that's about all I noticed. I sure didn't want to leave my truck and confront this person, so I did what I thought was best. I turned my truck on and began honking the horn until all of my friends were awake. I rolled down the window and told them we needed to get out of there immediately. After seeing what I saw, we did exactly that. Meanwhile, this person hadn't moved, mind you. Just as I thought it was bad, the situation got even worse. More of these figures began appearing in front of us through the trees. They were wearing the same outfits as mentioned earlier, but with multiple different masks. I immediately put my truck into reverse and began speeding away. They began walking closer and closer, but luckily I was able to drive out of the spot in time. As I sped down the road out of there, 3 more of these figures appeared from the side of my truck. This time with a dog and way more aggressively than the previous ones I saw. They began throwing rocks at my truck and chasing after me. At one point, they were literally right next to my passenger window until I accelerated even more and eventually lost them. As I looked back in my mirror, I saw only one figure left, simply peeking and staring at me from behind a tree. This image is forever seared into my head. From that night on, I refused to ever go back up there. I've never, ever spoken of this to anyone, even when I was around my friends who experienced this. We never mentioned it to each other. It's been over a year now since this happened, and all I can say is that I believe these people were in some sort of cult. I've heard other stories about similar events happening and even cattle completely disappearing. It's very barbaric, and you wouldn't think that such a beautiful national park that attracts so many people year-round would have such dark and disturbing secrets. My advice to anyone who decides to travel to these mysterious and preserved parks of intrinsic beauty would be to always bring some form of protection. Likewise, make sure you let others know about your plans and never go alone. There are hundreds of missing persons reports across the national parks inside the United States, and I could have very well been one of them if I had stayed just a few minutes longer. Nature has a way of attracting very different types of people. Some want to explore and push themselves to their limits, while some simply don't want to be seen and lurk in the darkness of night. A former Green Beret once told me the key to survival was always being aware of your surroundings and listening to your instincts. If a particular situation doesn't feel right, chances are it's not. Stay safe, everyone.